It was after he went to the garden. It was after he was arrested. It was after he was tried. It was after he was crucified. It was after he was laid in that grave. It was after that Sunday morning when they found the grave empty. And we read later that day in the Gospel according to Luke, in chapter 24, beginning with verse 30. When he, this mysterious stranger, who had caught up with two disciples on the road to Emmaus, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened Scripture to us?" Then they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and say, "It is true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. May God bless this reading of his holy word. May he bless it to our hearing. May he bless it such that he opens our eyes as well. I guess it was about 35 or 40 years ago, I met this older man who told me that he was originally from the mountains of western North Carolina. And as we talked, we chatted back and forth. And he said, "I want to tell you about something that happened to me back when I was a teenager." And this would have put it back in about the 1930s. Now remember, he was from the mountains of western North Carolina, a rather remote area. Houses were far apart. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have hardly any modern conveniences out there at all. But he told me that one night he decided he wanted to go to this barn dance that was going to happen. And he went to the dance. And when he left it, by then it was totally dark. No moon was shining that night. And as I said, there were no electricity, so no street lights. But you know, when you're out like that, your eyes do adjust to the dark somewhat. And at least, if you're real careful, you can pick your way along and get where you need to go. Well, he was doing that, but as he walked along, his mind sort of wandered. He couldn't help but think about stories he had heard recently about a bear that was marauding through the neighborhood. And as he walked along, he thought more and more about that bear, and he was listening for every noise, every sound that might be that bear. Well, he said that he lived off the main road across this little creek, and there wasn't a bridge rather, across this creek, but there was a foot log. He got there and he found the log, found the place. And usually, he said, there was a long pole that was kept at one end or the other so that someone walking along it could use it to balance themselves, to keep from getting overbalanced as they walked across this log. He said, though he felt and he felt and he looked, and that pole was nowhere to be found. Apparently someone had crossed the bridge or crossed the log and left it on the other side. Well, since it was dark and the log itself from the rushing water underneath was damp and wet, slippery, he decided the safest thing to do would be to get down on his hands and knees and crawl across that foot log. He started doing that, listening intently every moment for any sound that might be that bear. And as he crawled along, he said he got about halfway across the bridge, across the log, and lo and behold, he ran into something. And he looked up, and just vaguely silhouetted against that night sky, he could see this shape in front of him. And he knew without any doubt whatsoever that it was that bear. Now, when you're in a situation like that, you have to know what to do, and you have to do it in a hurry if you don't want to get hurt. So he said he either fell or jumped off that log just as fast as he could into that cold, rushing mountain water. And he started struggling, trying to get to the other side. And right after he hit the water, he heard another big splash. And it was that bear. But in the confusion, well, he managed to get across the creek, get on the bank, and run as fast as he could to his home. Counted his lucky stars that he had made it safely. Well, the next morning he went back out to the log. Of course, there was no sign of the bear by then. But he did happen to run into an acquaintance of his, a friend. And he started to tell this friend, boy, I have to tell you what happened to me last night. And the friend said, oh, something happened to me too. I was crossing the foot log, and I had the pole in my hand, and about halfway across, I ran into that bear. He was down on his all fours. And before he had time to rear up and claw me, I jumped into the water. He did too, but I guess in the water he lost my scent, and I got away from him. Yeah, you guessed it. They ran into each other on that log. That wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the last time that there's been a case of mistaken identity. Sometimes a case of mistaken identity doesn't end well. Sometimes, though, it does, like that night, and like on the evening of Jesus' resurrection. Backing up in chapter 24, we read in verses 13 and 14, now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. It had been a tumultuous week. It had been a week of incredible highs and of devastating lows. Jesus had entered Jerusalem like a king. Then he had been arrested like a criminal. And finally he had been executed like some enemy, an enemy of the state. And that wasn't all. That morning there had been reports that the tomb was empty. And even some who said he was still alive. Yep. These two had plenty to talk about with each other. We read then in verses 15 through 18. as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Cleopas. This is the only place in the Bible that he's mentioned. He's called a disciple, but since he wasn't one of the 12, undoubtedly he had to be part of this wider group of 72 disciples that only Luke mentions. And then there's his companion. Couldn't Luke have found out from some of the people, some of the disciples? Couldn't he have found out the name of this other disciple? Or did he know the name and for some reason hesitated to mention it? Makes you wonder perhaps if this other disciple somehow abandoned the faith and therefore wasn't worthy to be mentioned. That's a possibility. But some scholars think that the other companion was a woman, maybe Cleopas' wife. And in ancient writings back then, women were typically not considered worthy to be named in a book of all things. That's a possibility. But that notwithstanding, the stranger caught up with them. They may not have had modern communication, not even newspapers, but word had gotten around, and who in Jerusalem could not have heard of all the things that had happened of this Jesus being caught, being tried, being executed? How could that be? And this unknown person comes up with them. There's no indication in the Bible that they heard him behind them, but then all of a sudden he was there. And they just assumed that he was walking along and caught up with them. They assumed. Does that remind you of any other instance where two fellows met and they assumed something about the other? Well, anyway, this man, this stranger, caught up with them, and he began a conversation with them. It begins innocently enough. "What things?" he asked. What things had happened? And it began. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. And as soon as they said that, it was as if all this pent-up emotion that they had had from those events, it was as if the floodgates opened and they just had to pour everything out. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. they came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see. It was a confusing time. It was an emotional time. And these two disciples just didn't know what to believe and what not to believe. They didn't know what was rumor and what was fact. They didn't know what had been verified and what was just someone jumping to conclusions. Have you ever been like that? Have you ever been in a situation where you just were unsure what to believe? When you're in a situation like that, given enough time, you can usually work it out. Usually, given enough time, but it always helps if you have someone who knows what's what and can help you, can explain it to you, can tell you this is what the truth is. These are the facts. And there was this stranger, this mysterious stranger who caught up with them. And he said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. That must have been for them like a searchlight penetrating the darkness. So it's no wonder that what next they said was, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And once he was in with them, something even more amazing took place. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened scriptures to us?" Here is what for me is the takeaway from this passage. These disciples had witnessed all the things many of the things that Jesus had done. They had witnessed miracles, some of them at least, and they had been told of others. They had heard him explain about the kingdom of heaven. They had heard him open scripture before. They were invested in Jesus. They were invested emotionally, and they were invested spiritually in him, maybe even more than they realized. And somehow somehow in the breaking of bread, Jesus' presence was revealed to them. Early this morning, in the cold, and amid the noise of traffic going by, the sight of 4 or 6 deer coming by and stopping and looking at us, we stood. We stood not unlike those disciples of old as the sun was coming up. That was a time to be astonished, a time even to be confused. And we, like those early disciples, we've heard of all the things that Jesus said and did and taught, but we didn't travel the dusty roads of Palestine with him. Some among us have witnessed miracles, but for most, they're secondhand. That you are here this morning means that you, like those 2 disciples on the road, are invested in Jesus. Maybe more so than you realize yourself. Maybe like those 2 disciples, you have all this pent up within you. These emotions, these feelings, and you're looking for an opportunity to let it all out. Maybe you don't understand it all, but now we are going to break bread with Jesus. Will Jesus open your eyes in the breaking of bread the way he did those 2 disciples? That you recognize him, that you recognize him in the process of breaking bread, that you recognize him in your life. And afterward, after we break bread, you will have an invitation to share how he opened your eyes